We are breaking into programming to go to Israel, where the parliament has approved the first part of controversial judicial changes. It includes limiting the power of Supreme Court judges. This bill forms part of a wider package of changes that protesters have been out on the streets demonstrating against all year. Critics say the bill is a threat to democracy. Let's go live now to our correspondent, Mohammed Jamjoom. He's joining us live from West Jerusalem. And as expected, Mohammed, Parliament has ratified one of the contested laws limiting the Supreme Court's powers.
Elizabeth, that's right. That very contentious bill has now passed. We have gotten reports that the opposition has left. Members of the opposition in the Knesset have left the building. There are reports that they did not vote on that third and final reading of this bill. They wouldn't have had to have voted for it to pass because Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's far right-wing coalition, well, they have 4 more seats. They had the votes to pass this all along. The question throughout the day was the Prime Minister going to try to forge some kind of a compromise with the opposition? There have been high-level talks all day behind the scenes. The Israeli President Isaac Herzog has been practically begging the Prime Minister to try to come to some sort of a compromise with the opposition to soften the language of the bill. That apparently did not come to pass. We should tell our viewers a little bit more about this bill. This is a bill that would limit oversight of the Supreme Court. Basically, it means that the Supreme Court would no longer have the power to overrule government or ministerial decisions that it deems unreasonable. That means that oversight powers of the Supreme Court and other courts in this country have now been, as critics say, substantially weakened. As you mentioned, this is just one bill that was voted on today. It's part of a larger package of proposed laws by the Prime Minister and his far right-wing coalition partners. These laws were first proposed several months ago, and everything came to a head this past March because those proposals were so contentious and so controversial, and there were hundreds of thousands of people that kept coming out onto the streets, and because there was a general strike, well, the Prime Minister then shelved that proposal. But then in the past couple of weeks, compromise talks between the Prime Minister and the opposition broke down. The opposition walked away from the table. They said that they did not believe the Prime Minister was negotiating in good faith. Well, right now we're in a situation where the Knesset is going to go on its summer break at the end of this month. The Prime Minister was under a great deal of pressure from his far right-wing coalition to try to pass at least one part of his proposed overhaul of the judiciary. As you mentioned, critics of this bill and the larger plan have said that this will substantially weaken democracy in Israel. They are really worried about what this means. To that end, let me just mention the protesters that have been out all morning. Their numbers, they're only increasing in the last hour. They are very loud and boisterous right now. They knew that that vote was ongoing. They are extremely upset. There had been some hope in the last few hours that perhaps there would be some way that the Prime Minister would be convinced to step back from the brink, that because of the pressure he's under, not just from these demonstrators. There have been hundreds of thousands of demonstrators throughout the country demonstrating the past week, but also because he's come under pressure from members of the reservists in Israel's military who've said that they will not report for duty if this bill were to pass. So right now, this country really in crisis, very polarized, and the demonstrators say they're going to keep coming out no matter what happens going forward.
And as you've mentioned, Mohammed, Prime Minister Netanyahu has come under immense pressure this year, but the fact remains that he's been able to, this bill is passed because he has a parliamentary majority. We've seen hundreds of thousands, as you've been reporting, of protesters out on the streets all year, every weekend of this year. But what are the opposition's options now? Do they have any?
Well, that's what's unclear. The opposition had tried every way that they could to try and delay voting on this bill. It just didn't come to pass for them. They didn't have the votes at the end of the day. Now, there's a lot of talk right now in Israeli media and among political analysts here right now that perhaps because of interventions from the president and other high-ranking leaders in this country, that perhaps the Prime Minister would try to forge some kind of compromise and add amendments to this bill going forward that would soften the language and it wouldn't limit the oversight as much as had been proposed initially. But look, this has now passed. It passed its final reading. So essentially the Prime Minister doesn't have to. But if he doesn't, and if he just keeps going forward with this plan, it does seem as though more demonstrators are going to continue to come out. They're very, very angry. The opposition is angry, but the Prime Minister is under pressure from members of his government. And just in the last few hours, it was reported that members of his coalition had said that if he essentially steps back or softens the language or adds amendments that they don't agree to, that they would then walk away from his government. And that would mean that the government would collapse. So it's a very tricky time right now. It's a time, everybody I've spoken with here today say that they've never seen a time when this country was in more of a crisis.
Yeah.
They're extremely worried about what this means for democracy going forward. So many of the people that I've spoken with said they believe that this puts the country onto a road towards autocracy. So it's very worrying for everybody who's out here. But at the same time, they say they're going to continue to come out and oppose, and they're going to push opposition parliamentarians to try to do whatever they can to keep the Prime Minister from going forward with his additional plans. Elizabeth?
And Mohammed, it's been said that if this part of the changes were passed, and they have been passed on Monday, the other sections of the bill will be easier to pass, hasn't it?
Well, that's really an open question right now, Elizabeth, because there were even more controversial parts of the proposals that the Prime Minister essentially had to take off the table. And essentially what's happened is that the Prime Minister knew that there was so much opposition that he was not going to be able to pass this package of proposed laws in one go. And so what he's done is he stepped back and then he started breaking up the proposal and seeing what he could pass. And that's how we got to where we are today. He wanted to get this bill passed. That bill has now passed. But there are other even more incendiary parts of that proposed legislation. There was one in particular that angered so many just a few months ago that would have, if passed, essentially allowed members of parliament to overrule Supreme Court decisions. As we understand it, that is no longer on the table. But might it come back on the table in the days or weeks or months to come? We really don't know. The Prime Minister is in a bit of a bind right now, and he's trying to balance a lot of the pressures around him. The demonstrators keep coming out. They are extremely angry. The military reservists, they are very angry. And that puts this country into even more of a crisis, because you've had military leaders the past few days say that the fact that over 10,000 reservists across different branches of the Army now have said that they won't report for duty if this bill passes, they say that that impacts the military readiness and preparation of this country. So that could essentially cause, problems if there were a security threat that they perceived going forward. So it's really going to be a delicate balance, obviously, for the Prime Minister. But these demonstrators who are behind me, and there's more coming up this road, and we expect to see more in the coming hours, they're just saying this is unacceptable to them. They're going to do all they can to oppose any plans the Prime Minister has going forward to try to overhaul the judiciary any more than he already has.
Yeah, something that they have repeated all year, isn't it, Mohammed? Thank you very much for that. For now, that is our correspondent, Mohammed Jamjoon, joining us live from West Jerusalem. We're going to stay with this now and bring in Marwan Bishara. He's Al Jazeera's senior political analyst, and he's joining us from Paris on Skype. Good to see you, Marwan. Is this what you expected?
Well, it wasn't actually clear. You would think that the voice of reason would end up on top, and that the country cannot afford to continue with the same paralysis that it seems like it's going through now, and the same divisions and schism that apparently paralyzing much of its cultural, political, and economic life. But clearly, those in the coalition government think differently than the voice of rationale. They think more in terms of power and authority. They think more in terms of ideology and fanaticism. They think it's their chance, and they clearly don't want to miss this chance, certainly don't want to postpone it for another 15 months, as the opposition leaders were proposing. They think it's their chance to pass one important piece of legislation that will enable them as individuals. I'm talking about people like Prime Minister Netanyahu, who have been indicted on 3 different charges. I'm talking about Ehud Derry, one of the main coalition leaders, the head of Chas, who's been indicted and imprisoned on tax evasion but want to become Minister of Finance. These sorts of leaders within the coalition governments have just now passed a piece of legislation that will allow them to serve open-endedly, regardless of any objection from any branch of the judiciary, including the Supreme Court. So in the midst of this controversy, if you will, I think there is a real sense that the corrupt leaders of this coalition are making sure that they will disable democracy and the rule of law in order for them to continue to rule within Israel.
Will the Israeli public stand for that, though? We've seen the kind of opposition, we've seen the opposition all year to these protests. They're not going to go away, are they?
It doesn't seem like it. In fact, they are doubling down. And they're doubling down in a way whereby it's not just individuals, it's not just the thousands. What's more important in a country like Israel is that institutions are joining in, meaning, the 150 plus important corporations, the high-tech industry, some parts of the old army reserves, and the former generals, and trade unions and labor unions, and so on and so forth. All these are very important pillars of the state. And the fact that they are joining in the protest movement against the ongoing efforts by this coalition governments to end democracy as we know it for the majority of Jews within Israel is a clear sign that Israel is, of course, up to a major storm in the days, weeks, and months ahead. But that was coming regardless of whether there was or was not a compromise today, because Israel is divided between, let's just call them for the time being, for the sake of brevity and for the sake of clarity to our viewers around the world, let's just say Israel is divided. Israel as the Jewish state that's been in a state of war its entire life is now divided between hardcore generals and fanatical rabbis. Who will win, the rabbis or the generals? For many years, the rabbis, the fanatical rabbis, and the generals have coexisted. But over the last few months, and since this government was formed, with 5 out of the 6 parties making the coalition being religious of the most radical kind, the ultra-Orthodox or the ultra-Zionist, ultra-conservative, 5 religious parties are making sure that they're going to block the Supreme Court from objecting to their rulings, and they want to transform Israel into a Jewish autocracy, perhaps even a theocracy, if they can. And in fact, Marwan, Elizabeth, they have been saying it.
All right, Marwan, thank you very much for that. No doubt we will be coming back to you over the next few hours. That is our senior political analyst, Marwan Bishara.